How many times have you heard the statement, I wish I could see something like that? Or, oh, you're so lucky. I'd give anything to see that up close. Or my favorite, why didn't you just take a picture to prove it? Being the witness of something impossible is not the miraculous spiritual encounter that most imagine. In Deborah Hatzwell's book, The Fortunate Unfortunates, Children Who Witness Impossible Creatures, she explains what it's like to be a child who encountered something that no one else can quickly explain or fix, or a rushed explanation from a parent who wants to help their child but doesn't know how. Children have a vivid imagination, and this is something we should encourage in them, but it can be a double-edged sword. These children can spend their entire lives into adulthood to prove to others they're not actually crazy in need of medical intervention. They just saw something that affected their entire life. Children typically don't go out trying to find Bigfoot or have equipment like a researcher hoping to have an encounter with a creature. It happens by chance. That face is etched in memory, and for most children it was a terribly traumatic experience that refuses to go away. Deborah writes, honestly, deep down we always will be that frozen child. I struggled with my encounter for decades, and many of the witnesses she interviewed for her book had a similar reaction. Children play in unused land, abandoned areas, and the woods. Many of these stories begin with, I was out with the dog, or I was on my usual walk. Deborah writes, I grew up in an ordinary town. My mother worked for the local authority, and my father in the famous Boddington's brewery. My family worked in Salford port and mines for generations. My grandfather owned a local scrap yard. A man with a horse and cart who chose to collect all the metal you didn't want or was of no use would reward you with a doll or a balloon. Simple, hard-working people who lived in this very ordinary manufacturing town in northwest England. Salford was a working-class town that was heavily bombed in World War II due to the Manchester Ship Canal running through our town. The River Irwell flows from the North Sea, and the valley runs through what was my playground as a child. Then there were limited restrictions on having fun, riding carriage horses or catching critters in a jar and taking them home. We built wooden dens guarded by fierce children with stones ready to defend their forts. Ideal times and fond memories. I don't remember much before I saw him, or for about an hour and a half the time it took to get home after the encounter. In the center of the park is an old Edwardian home, country gardens and golf course and meadow, a petting zoo with goats, rabbits, horses, and birds. There was a wonderful glass house with tropical plants from all over the world. A world like a vast rainforest inside a glass dome. The glass house was always warm. Steam rose from a large koi pond in the center. There was also a sheltered butterfly home, which was like a steamy bath. Most people called it the hot house. It was open to the public and entry was free. There was also a garden for the blind. Under each flower or bush, many tactile and strong-smelling plants and herbs were metal braille plates. Whenever I smell lavender or wild garlic, I'm transferred back to the warm days of my childhood. In the 70s, the gardens were beautifully maintained. One of my family members worked there, and my father took me with him when he could. I have many pictures of me as a child here until this day. In 82, by 1982, the park was in a rougher state. Many groundsmen were laid off. The old building became an art gallery or mining museum. It changed so many times over the decades and now stands broken, abandoned, and vandalized. The view is truly deplorable. Between the house and the Century Garden was an old Victorian flower bed, which sounds lovely, but now is a tangle of weeds, ivy, and was left to grow about 25 feet tall, and in between it was a flat area that was almost like a bed of sorts. And we climbed through the thorns and stinging needles to look out, but people walking by wouldn't know we were there at all. So if you shut up and hide there until about 3:20 p.m., you can walk home with the other kids and look like you were at school the whole time. That was the plan for the afternoon, but 2 hours later I ran out of that park crying and screaming away from the monster I thought was coming to hurt me. And it must have been chasing me in my mind as I recklessly ran home without any thought. My only fear that day was being caught skipping school. It wouldn't be fun walking to school the next day with a clipped ear as a reminder of my mom, who couldn't stand much messing around from me. I remember us talking about the top of pop music charts and thinking of plans for what to do that night after tea, and laughing, sitting sprawled on the grass, looking up at the sky and forgetting we were in danger of getting caught. We forgot to be quiet and openly made a racket like most teenage girls do. I remember looking up and watching the leaves out of the corner of my eyes as they moved. In my peripheral vision, I saw movement in the shade for a split second. At first, I looked at it thinking bird or cat, but nothing moved. Like that moment before a storm or a ship goes down, when your brain is processing the danger, when everything goes quiet and fight or flight response kicks in. I realized that what I was looking at was not the color of a bird or the flash of a ginger tom, but eyes. Eyes the same color as amber on an impossible face. Even as a down-to-earth girl, I thought, oh my God, there's a teacher. We are in for it now. Excuses were already made in my head. If only I thought to run before he looked out, before I saw his face. I can never forget, no matter how hard I tried. Before I could get up from the ground, before my legs started running, before I let out a scream that I had never repeated in my 51 years. Something that looks like a man and an ape somehow joined together. Furry with long and dark brown hair with auburn highlights as the sun caught it, which sounds romantic, but it wasn't. It was the color of a red setter before he bites the hand holding the cookie. Something that beautiful yet deadly and intelligent. The phrase, he looked like a man and an ape, is the phrase I've used to describe him ever since, simply because he is. He looked like an old, weathered and worn caveman or an escaped ape who was also human, a Neanderthal creature with hair everywhere, a thick jaw and a clear eyebrow, a terrible face staring at me from the foliage. I don't remember the smell or the sound, only the fear. Then I looked at him. My friend, and not even knowing why we started running, I pushed her hand to the ground as hard as I could without thinking of the process. I now know that it was a primal instinct for survival. I felt guilty thinking about it ever since. Even now, I was on my feet, and when I looked back to see if he was chasing and that she was also on her feet running too, I saw him just melt back into the greenery like he was never there. He had teeth like ours, not fangs or sharp like a dog, square like a human. I think they were just bigger, and where I was, he was taller than a man, probably about 7 feet tall, dark tan skin, and although he had a weathered face, I don't think he was old. Rather, he lived in the sun, like men who paved the roads back in the day, got tan and weathered. His eyes were like ours, but not clean and white, rather yellow. I focused on his eyes and teeth, waiting for him to run out and grab us and do something with the teenage girls he found in the woods, or an arm that would hit me with such force that I would be flat on my back, an easy prey in seconds. But nothing happened. He ran one way, and I ran like the wind all the way home, being physically sick a number of times. I didn't care about the punishments. I didn't care how angry she was going to be. I ran in the door expecting my mom to get down on her knees and comfort me, and bloody hell, Deb, what have you done to your uniform? That's a real mess, was not the reaction I needed. She throws my sweater off me and shoves me over to the sink as I try to explain. The ape man tried to grab me when my mom says, "Don't be silly, it was probably just an illusion. Don't tell your dad you didn't go to school or you will be in for it." At which I burst into tears all over again and tried to explain what happened. At first, her answer really upset me, but I couldn't stop the tears. When I got angry that she didn't believe me, and a little angry that I wasn't warned about such things. If there is a crazy ape-like thing out there, the adults would know and warn you for sure. Then I realized that Mom didn't brush me off because she had her hands full with my dad, me and my sister, 2 jobs and an aging parents to care for, and was just over my drama. She had no idea, and that meant neither did anyone else. Realizing I was alone in this was the worst feeling I've ever felt. Years later, as a 30-year-old single mother of 2, I was told you will probably never walk unaided again. After a really bad accident that shook me to the core, but it was nothing compared to that cold, sick feeling in the pit of my stomach when fear becomes reality, when your whole world suddenly goes blurry, and when you feel your knees start to give out from the sudden realization that you have to go back there tomorrow for another 6 months or so before starting college. I don't think I slept a wink for weeks. Every shadow was his, every noise or crash, the sudden running of footsteps were no longer just another kid running, but someone of his kind coming towards me. This fear stayed with me throughout my teens and 20s because it was never mentioned out loud like a massive ape man in the room, or when it was mentioned, it was like, oh, how dramatic, it was just a homeless guy. Are you still going on about that? You would think at this age you'd be done. So I stopped talking about it, stopped saying how confused and scared I was, dropped everything and just went off the rails there for a few years. Marriage and kids didn't drown it out. No vacations in the woods or climbing trips. I remember a coworker offering a free downtown park cabin in the woods for 2 weeks, and the horrified look on my face at the idea gave him the impression I was an incredibly ungrateful friend who should probably count her blessings. As she walked away in a huff, I stood there confused, not knowing what to say or how to explain why I turned down the offer without telling her why. Many times my parents would go away on holidays and weekends, and I would stay in my nan's safe apartment building away from his kind. Don't get me wrong, I walked the streets of Southford like most of us at night in the dark growing up. The terraced cobblestone streets, car lights, people from all over the city. Like most people with a phobia, I learned to hide it, to adjust my world around it so that it no longer seemed like a problem. And somehow I managed to cut it off for a long time, but deep down, it was always there in the background, fragmented until I realized that I had to cut it off for a long time, but I had to find others who might have seen him too, which would make him a reality. Or my best hope for others who might know something that might explain it all. A visit from the local circus, maybe some kind of monkey movie was being made. I found those who have seen him too, and they were not hard to find. People like me. Hundreds of these stories like mine. which she tells in her book. Cryptids are extremely elusive by nature. People rarely see one, and even rarer are people who see the same mysterious creature multiple times. However, it was almost unheard of for cryptids to seem to follow someone around, chasing them like unearthly hounds. This is exactly what happened to an anonymous Florida zoologist between 2010 and 2013. He was 18 years old in 2012 when he sent his testimony to cryptozoologist Linda Godfrey. He then volunteered at the Florida Museum of Paleontology and worked towards degrees in zoology and paleontology. Suffice it to say that he must have been the witness to distinguish a familiar animal from something abnormal. He swore to Gottfried that his story was completely true, and Gottfried claimed that his extensive knowledge of flora and fauna of the local area made his story particularly more convincing. He is the first person he has told about the incident who was not involved. He lives in a canal system. Wildlife sometimes enters the canal for various reasons, and these life forms usually include fish, birds, dolphins, manatees, and sometimes even bull sharks and alligators. Canals are where fresh water meets the ocean. The water inside them is usually quite shallow, but it is impossible to see the bottom or the amazing wildlife found in their shallow depths due to the thickness of the mud and silt in the water. And objects' details that are more than 3 inches away from the surface are invisible, and objects are completely invisible when they are more than a foot beneath the surface. The witness was on spring break when the presence of the strange entity that later tormented him was alluded to and made himself known. It was March 2010, and he was at the dock washing his family's small sailboat. There were some thick clouds hovering overhead, but overall it was a good day and the sun was shining. He had just finished washing the boat when he saw a manatee drifting towards him in the water. They were apparently attracted to the sound of running hoses as they enjoy drinking flowing water. He lowered the hose a bit before wrapping the hose around the side of the dock to offer a drink to the gentle aquatic mammal. He noticed it moving slightly strangely, but his concern was confirmed when the creature rolled over, revealing several deep bite marks in a U shape on its front flipper. He had never seen a manatee with bite marks before. They probably have no natural predators due to their large size and tough skin. Usually all the scars on the bodies of majestic animals are from boat propellers, but the way this mark was placed on the creature's skin showed that it was definitely an animal bite. The lines left by a shark were not visible, and although the alligators matched the cone-shaped marks left in the narrow row of teeth that bit the manatee, even the big bullheads were usually not big enough to take a manatee. As he continued to study the manatee, it became increasingly clear to him that something massive and unknown resided in the ecosystem. The creature's body was riddled with cuts and bites, and part of its tail flap had apparently been torn off. Something big enough to attack a 1-ton manatee could easily swallow a human. Later, he and some dock workers took the boat out on the river for a short trip, but the joyful part of that joyride might have been missing, for this feeling of being watched constantly tormented him, but he put it down because they sometimes saw other boatmen, and the feeling might have been due to their presence. Finally, they landed at a small island where the witness said he often saw pelicans nesting. It was close to breeding season, yet there was not a single bird on the island. There were birds on the other islands, but on this one they were conspicuously absent. Exploring the island, he found broken branches up to his height. There were birds on the island, so it would not be wise for hunters to stay there, and tourists tend to avoid it because of the rugged landscape. A human explanation for the lack of birds didn't make much sense either, because it seemed unlikely that the whole colonies of birds would abandon a safe haven from raccoons and possums in the forest because of the presence of a few humans. There was nothing. Tracks were visible under all the fallen leaves, but he saw skid marks too angular to be a boat on the other side of the island under all the fallen leaves. He began to feel that he was being watched, and it was dark outside, so he decided to leave the island. It was early June 2011 when our anonymous witness encountered the swamp monster again. He was with his scout group in the wilderness of River Lakes Conservation Park, and the sun was setting. It was 7 p.m. and he decided he was done wandering in the wilderness, so he started to head back to camp. However, to return home, he had to cross the path of marshland. Although the sky was still quite clear and only slightly cloudy, the thick tree cover made it a little darker. River Lakes Conservation Park is a large group of swamps, lakes, forests, and savannas bordered on the waterways. He approached the swampy terrain between him and his destination, and as soon as he did, the forest fell silent. He had previously seen many deer and songbirds, and even heard a bobcat yowling, but it was as if they had all suddenly left the area. It was very confusing. He circled around the marsh, passing under the pines, before suddenly hearing a small splash in the water. At first he thought it was a fish, but then he became very worried, knowing he might be in danger. He had just picked up speed when he heard movement in the water again, and what he thought might be a small hissing noise. He turned in time to see a dark figure standing under the trees before it sank into the water. In a few brief moments he could see it. He couldn't make out many of its features, but judging by the fact that the water was about 4 feet deep and it was waist high on the creature, it seemed inhumanely tall. Overall, the contours didn't feel right to be a person. It was only about 60 feet away from him, and he panicked as the creature dove under the water as if heading straight for him. The witness was horrified and headed back to camp as quickly as possible. During the next 2 years, he sometimes heard strange noises at night when he headed near swamps, rivers, or remote forests. It was as if the creature was following him. These sounds were usually quite distant, but sometimes he could make out sounds like bellows and hissing with relative clarity. However, these areas were home to many local species such as bobcats, coyotes, and owls, so he probably attributed the disturbing sounds to these creatures for his own peace of mind. It was April 2013, and manatees were just returning from their winter retreats to the river and its canals. And the witness decided to go to the water to see him and get some exercise at the same time. It was a beautiful day, relatively clear, and only a few distant clouds. He got into the kayak and paddled out of the canals into the mouth of the river until he spotted a small, uninhabited inlet of the riverbank. Manatees usually hang out in such areas due to the abundant food supply and calm waters, and the witness had several successful sightings of manatees around this particular island. He rounded a bend in the river and found a lagoon where he could clearly see footprints made by a manatee's broad tail fins. Strangely, the animal seemed to leave the lagoon quickly despite it being only noon. The manatee stayed in the lagoon and surrounding canals until about 7 before leaving, but that was not the case today. He dismissed it. However, because he saw only one manatee leave the lagoon and sometimes the manatees broke the pattern, now tired from rowing, he made one last push into the pond before placing the oar in his lap. The lagoon was beautiful, surrounded by peaceful forest. He pulled out his water for a drink, but did not notice the strangeness of the birds being completely absent from the scene. Something underwater hit his kayak, but he wasn't too surprised as he had encountered many different aquatic animals that do this. He was still in the water and knew that if something hit him, it wouldn't have to move, but that could mean many different things. It could be a floating log, a large fish, a manatee using the bottom of his boat as a back scraper, or even a bull shark making an exploratory bump to assess whether the kayak was suitable for food. He immediately thought it was a manatee, as they are common inhabitants of the lagoon. As he looked over to the edge, hoping to see a peaceful manatee, there was definitely something big moving there. It was dark in color and about the length of a manatee, but despite those features, he wasn't sure of its identity and quickly swam away. However, a commotion in the calm water suggested that the object was turning around, but he was not suspicious, as manatees often return to boats for repeated scratches. However, his composure quickly disappeared when he felt a second thump on the bottom of the boat. It was all wrong. It sounded like something solid moving across an old washboard. The manatee would have made a soft bump. Bull sharks and dolphins don't make the noise. It just made either. A strong fear began to form in his stomach, and as the figure moved out from under the kayak, he decided that the best course of action was to get out of the water as quickly as possible. The creature's outline was at least the same size, if not larger, than his kayak, about 14 feet or more, and it was considerably wider than the boat for most of its body. Before tapering, presumably into its tail, the shore of the lagoon was sandy and only 10 feet from him, so he stuck his oar in the water and paddled as fast as he could to get up on the sand. He shored up his kayak and ran a short distance across the beach, finally feeling safer. He then turned and watched as the figure approached the other bank about 20 feet away. As it went into shallower, clearer water, he could see more of its features against the white sand. It resembled an alligator with dark scales and a row of bony scales running down its back, explaining the bumping noise when it rubbed along the bottom of his kayak. It was big enough that it had to be an extra large male alligator, so the witness backed up the bank. The longer he looked, the less alligator he saw. It was the right color, black with a hint of blue, but its skull seemed to be much taller vertically than the broad skull of a normal alligator. Alligators have very short arms, but this creature's arms were very long and extended from its upper body. Clear muscle tissue showed through the creature's arms, and the fingers, of which there were apparently 5, looked much longer than usual, but of course it was hard to tell where the scale ended and the claws began, so all numbers were estimates. The monster rose from the ground, and the witness saw that its legs were at least twice as long as a normal alligator. The hindquarters were more twisted, meaning they were probably longer than the forequarters. The hindquarters were also thicker than a typical alligator, and unlike a typical reptile, all 4 limbs were held upright under the body like a mammal or dinosaur. The witness felt the blood drain from his face as the monster suddenly turned its head to look at him, perhaps seeing him through his peripheral vision or smelling him. He put his forelimbs down, as if to do a push, before rising his hind legs like a bear and looking directly at the witness. He was scared. He tried to scream, but found he couldn't make a sound. The creature had a very strong build and was about 6.5 to 7 feet tall. His belly was pale yellow, and his sternum and muscles were visible through his chest. He also thought he could see its ribs, but no genitalia. But that's normal for reptiles with internal genitalia. Its arms hung from its sides and reached its hips. The tail, similar to a normal alligator tail, slumped at the ground as expected. The creature had no lips, so the teeth were clearly visible. Rather than comparing it to human, the witness said it looked like a bear or an ape. His posture seemed to be hunched over. The animal raised its arms at the elbows and let out a piercing hiss, not unlike a normal alligator, but much more deeper, opening its mouth and growling before roaring its throat as alligators do, making a bellow so deep that the witness affirms that he felt it in his body. The witness was just about to turn and run when the creature turned too, wandered off into the woods, and took a dozen steps on its hind legs before dropping to all fours and disappearing into the foliage. After that, he heard it rustle in the brush for another minute. Stunned by what he had just seen, he stood there for a minute before making the wise decision to tie his kayak to a tree and take the nearby highway home instead of returning to the water where the creature could reach him. He then drove his truck, accompanied by a friend and armed with a machete, to the lagoon to retrieve the kayak. The witness was still in utter terror after his encounter with the creature, but later that day he was with the same friend. He promised earlier that they would sleep in his sailboat with 2 wide bunks in the cabin. He hid how he was afraid to go back into the water, and the fact that it was now dark and raining did not make him any more at ease. Visibility was still good as the clouds were not very thick, and there was light rain. When 10 o'clock came, they sealed the cabin door and put out the lights. And the friend was asleep in about 10 minutes. The witness stayed awake for another hour, which he knew because he had a watch with him, both listening to the calm sound of the storm and trying to put what had happened earlier that day out of his mind. Finally, he fell asleep while the rain pattered lightly against the hatch window. He woke up around 3 in the morning, and he didn't understand why he woke up. Outside, the rain had reduced to a light drizzle, but there was still some thunder. When he looked through the skylight, he didn't see any party or anything by the canal, so he initially concluded that maybe the light flashed from a sensor in the house next door, or lightning struck somewhere nearby. He looked through the skylights and the plexiglass door, but saw nothing to explain his sudden awakening. All he could see there in the darkness was a distant streetlight obscured by a tree. Finally, he lay down and tried to go back to sleep, but he heard a hissing sound. Tremors ran down his spine, desperately hoping that he had imagined the noise, or simply that it wasn't where he thought it was coming from. He looked out at the harbor in front of the canal entrance and saw a figure on the far side of the canal, illuminated by the dim night light. The rain was pinging off its scaly body, and he realized that it was indeed the monster from before. He somehow knew that it had followed him back from the river and was now coming right at him. He couldn't explain how the thought twisted into his head. He panicked knowing there were no weapons in the cabin, and he wasn't even old enough to carry a weapon. His house was almost 100 feet away from the canal, and he could see the monster getting closer and closer. It was now only 50 feet away, right on top of his neighbor's sailboat. His only thought was to find a way to avoid the impending monster attack. So he turned and awoke his friend. He sat up and blinked. It took him about a moment to fully understand and regain consciousness before his eyes grew bigger than he had ever seen before. He looked behind him, and just then 2 loud bangs echoed through the deck. He was afraid to look behind him. When he mustered up the courage, he saw that the creature was directly against the boat and looked through the hatch into the cabin. The earlier swings were caused by him placing his hand against the side of the boat. The way said arms were positioned when the creature pointed its head down so that its eyes on the side of its head were not forward, could look into the cabin. The couple were afraid to move because they were afraid to do anything to provoke it. Don't move, shut up. To break into the boat. The creature would only need to climb onto the bottom of the boat about 2 feet above the water and break the plexiglass. The creature's breathing was very loud and only took a breath once every minute. Although the sense of danger from the situation did not disappear, he eventually realized that the creature seemed more curious than hungry. The strangest thing about it, he says, was how its bronze eyes seemed to glow. He tried to justify this by saying it was probably the glow of the eyes or some kind of bioluminescence. Common alligators have bright red around their eyes. The monster stayed there for about 5 minutes before letting out a short growl and moving away from the boat. At first, he was afraid it would turn and crawl into the boat, but it just landed back into the water and swam off into the stormy darkness. The pair was so scared and paranoid, thinking the monster was up to something, was some kind of trap, so they waited in the cabin until 9 in the morning before running all the way back to the house. Since then, he has been completely afraid of going to the pier. Although he used to enjoy going to the river regularly, the water is dark enough that he would never see it if it came to him. The latest update on his story came in the last days of December 2013, when he was reunited with the Gator Man after his 2 dogs off the dock. In great fear, he stepped into the darkness with a flashlight and raised his beam just in time to catch a huge figure on his dock. It bleated loudly like a full-grown alligator. The witness was horrified. It seemed to have followed him home.